He thought calling her to the piano would be a harmless joke, a moment of light entertainment for his students. But Professor Adrian Cole had no idea that in less than 5 minutes, his entire reputation would begin to unravel in front of everyone who had ever respected him. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall glass windows of the Whitmore Conservatory, casting long golden beams across polished marble floors that echoed softly with each passing step. And in the far corner of the grand rehearsal hall, Clara Whitfield moved quietly between music stands, gathering scattered sheets as if she were invisible to the world around her. At 38, Clara carried herself with a calm, unassuming presence, her soft brown hair tied back in a simple low bun, her modest gray cardigan slightly worn at the cuffs, the kind of detail that made people assume things about her without ever asking a single question. And for the past 2 months, that assumption had defined her existence inside these walls. To the students, she was just the woman who organized their sheet music, who wiped down the keys after practice, who stepped aside whenever someone more important walked through the room. And to Professor Adrian Cole, she was nothing more than a background figure, someone whose presence barely registered unless she happened to be in the way. Cole stood at the front of the hall now, his tailored navy blazer sharp against the soft lighting, his voice carrying authority as he addressed a semicircle of advanced piano students seated before him, each one watching carefully, eager to impress the man whose approval could shape their entire future. "Precision," he said, tapping the edge of the grand piano with a measured rhythm, "is what separates talent from mediocrity. Anyone can press keys, but very few can make them speak." A few students nodded, scribbling notes, while others exchanged subtle glances, the kind that carried both admiration and fear, because Cole was known not just for his brilliance, but for his ability to dismantle confidence with a single sentence. Across the room, Clara paused briefly, her hands resting lightly on a stack of sheet music as her eyes flickered toward the piano, not with curiosity, but with something deeper, something that looked almost like recognition, though it lasted only a second before she lowered her gaze again and continued her work. "Let's demonstrate," Cole continued, scanning the room as if searching for someone to make an example of, his gaze passing over each student before drifting, almost absent-mindedly, toward the corner where Clara stood. There was a brief pause, a shift in the air so subtle that most didn't notice it, but those closest to him could feel it, the moment when a decision was forming, when intention began to sharpen into action. "You," he said suddenly, his voice cutting clean through the room. "Why don't you come here for a moment?" Clara froze, just slightly, her fingers tightening around the edges of the paper she held as several students turned to look at her, confusion spreading across their faces, because she wasn't one of them. She wasn't even supposed to be part of the lesson. "Me?" she asked softly, her voice steady but quiet. Cole offered a thin smile, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. "Yes, you. You've been listening long enough. Let's see what you've picked up." A ripple of amusement passed through the students, some leaning back in their chairs, others whispering under their breath, because to them, this was unexpected, and unexpected often meant entertaining. Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second longer, then nodded politely, setting the papers down with careful precision before walking toward the piano, each step measured, each movement composed, as if she were stepping into a space she had long ago learned how to navigate. The room grew quieter, not out of respect, but anticipation, because no one quite knew what would happen next, only that whatever it was, it would not end well for her. And as Clara reached the bench and rested her hands gently at her sides, Professor Cole leaned back slightly, folding his arms with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, completely unaware that the silence settling over the room was not the calm before a mistake, but the quiet before something extraordinary. Clara lowered herself onto the piano bench with a quiet grace that felt almost out of place in a room charged with expectation, her hands resting loosely in her lap, as if she had all the time in the world, while behind her a few students shifted in their seats, barely concealing their curiosity, their skepticism, and in some cases, their amusement, because to them this moment was not about music. It was about watching someone step into a situation they clearly did not belong in, and Professor Adrian Cole allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to make the moment uncomfortable before speaking again, his tone smooth but edged with condescension as he gestured toward the keys, and said, "Let us keep this simple, something approachable, something even you can manage," his words drawing a faint ripple of laughter from the back row as one student whispered under his breath that this should be interesting, while another leaned forward, elbows on knees, eager to witness what they assumed would be a brief and awkward attempt at performance. Clara did not react to any of it. Not the laughter, not the whispers, not even the tone of the man standing just a few feet behind her. Instead, she lifted her hands slowly and placed them above the keys without pressing down, her fingers hovering with a stillness that seemed almost deliberate, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. And for a moment, nothing happened. The room suspended in that strange space between expectation and reality, until Cole cleared his throat lightly and added with a hint of impatience, "You may begin whenever you are ready," which only made the tension more pronounced because now every eye in the room was fixed on her, waiting, measuring, judging. Clara took a quiet breath, her shoulders rising and falling almost imperceptibly, and then she pressed the first key. The sound was soft, almost fragile, but it carried through the hall with a clarity that immediately shifted something in the air, subtle enough that no one could quite name it, yet undeniable once it was there. And before anyone could fully process it, she continued, her fingers moving with a precision that did not match the hesitant picture they had built of her, each note placed exactly where it belonged, not rushed, not forced, but guided with a control that felt intentional, practiced, lived in, and the faint smirk on Cole's face began to falter, just slightly, as he watched her hands move across the keyboard with a confidence that did not ask for permission. A few students exchanged glances, their earlier amusement replaced by something closer to confusion, because this was not what they had expected, not even close, and yet no one spoke, as if acknowledging it out loud might disrupt whatever was unfolding in front of them. And Clara continued without hesitation, her posture steady, her expression calm, her focus entirely on the instrument as though the room behind her no longer existed. The melody began to take shape, growing more complex, more layered, and with each passing measure it became increasingly clear that this was not a random attempt or a lucky sequence of notes. This was something structured, something intentional, something that required more than basic familiarity. And Cole shifted his weight subtly, his arms no longer folded as tightly across his chest, his gaze narrowing as he tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed to be true, because the woman he had dismissed just minutes ago was not supposed to sound like this. She was not supposed to move like this, and she certainly was not supposed to command the room without saying a single word. The students felt it too, that shift from passive observation to something closer to attention, real attention, the kind that pulls you forward without asking, and one by one they leaned in, their earlier expressions fading into something quieter, more focused, as if they were witnessing something they did not yet understand but could not look away from. And in that growing silence, the kind that builds rather than settles, Clara Whitfield continued to play, unaware, or perhaps simply unconcerned with the way the room was beginning to change around her, while Professor Adrian Cole stood just behind her, the first hint of doubt flickering across his face like a shadow he could not quite shake. The music did not hesitate, and neither did she. As Clara's fingers moved with a certainty that felt almost effortless, gliding across the keys in a way that transformed the piano from an instrument into a voice, each note connecting seamlessly into the next, building a structure so intricate that even the most advanced students in the room began to recognize something they had only encountered in theory, not in practice, and certainly not from someone they had dismissed moments ago, because this was not the sound of someone guessing. This was the sound of someone who understood, deeply and completely, what they were doing. The melody expanded, weaving into a more demanding passage, one that required precision, timing, and control beyond what most performers at their level could sustain. And yet Clara did not falter, her hands maintaining a steady rhythm as if guided by something far beyond conscious effort, while her expression remained composed, almost serene, as though she had stepped into a space where judgment could not reach her. A student in the front row leaned closer, his earlier smirk gone, replaced by a tight focus as he whispered quietly to the person beside him that this was not a beginner piece, not even close, and the other student nodded slowly, unable to look away, because the realization was beginning to spread through the room in small, silent waves. Something is not right. Or perhaps more accurately, something is far more right than it should be. Behind her, Professor Adrian Cole's posture shifted again, his confidence no longer anchored in certainty but in resistance, as if he were searching for a flaw that would restore the balance he had expected, a missed note, a hesitation, anything that could confirm his original assumption. But the longer she played, the less he found, and the absence of mistakes became its own kind of disruption, a quiet challenge to everything he believed about the hierarchy of talent and the order of this room. Clara transitioned into a more complex sequence, one that demanded not only technical skill but emotional interpretation, the kind that could not be memorized or imitated without understanding. And as she did, the sound changed, deepened, carrying a resonance that filled the hall and settled into the silence like something alive, something undeniable, and the students felt it, that shift from observation to immersion, where they were no longer watching someone perform but experiencing something they could not easily explain. One of them sat back slowly, exhaling under his breath as if he had been holding it without realizing, while another lowered her pen, her notes forgotten, her attention fully captured, because whatever this was, it demanded more than casual listening. The air in the room grew heavier, not with tension, but with awareness, the kind that makes every movement feel deliberate, every sound more significant. And in that awareness, Clara continued, her hands moving faster now, but never losing control, each motion precise, economical, purposeful, as if every note had already been decided long before her fingers touched the keys. Cole took a step closer, almost unconsciously, his eyes fixed on her hands, trying to follow the patterns, trying to understand how someone he had overlooked could navigate such complexity without strain. And for the first time, a question formed in his mind that he could not immediately answer. Who is she? Not in the casual sense, but in the deeper, unsettling way that challenges perception. Because the version of Clara Whitfield he had constructed did not match the reality unfolding in front of him. The room did not move, no one shifted, no one whispered now, because the moment had crossed into something else entirely, something that demanded silence not out of politeness, but out of recognition. And as Clara reached a passage that would have intimidated even the strongest students, her hands did not slow, her posture did not change, her focus did not break, and in that unwavering control, the final pieces of doubt began to fall away, leaving behind a single, undeniable truth that no one in that room could ignore any longer. By now, the music had moved beyond demonstration and into something that felt almost personal, as if Clara was no longer playing for the room, but for something far deeper, something that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. And the complexity of the piece continued to unfold with a level of control that no one present could dismiss or explain away, because what they were hearing required not only years of disciplined training, but a kind of intuitive mastery that could not be taught inside any classroom, no matter how prestigious. The tempo shifted again, faster now, more demanding, the kind of passage that separated even the most talented students from true performers. And yet Clara's hands did not hesitate, her fingers moving with an elegance that made the difficulty seem almost invisible, as though the challenge itself had been dissolved by her understanding of it. A student near the center of the room slowly shook his head, barely aware he was doing it, while another leaned back in his chair, eyes wide, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to disbelief, because they all knew what this meant, even if none of them were ready to say it out loud. This was not luck, this was not practice, this was something far beyond the level they had been working toward, something that placed Clara in a completely different category altogether. Behind her, Professor Adrian Cole's expression had lost its composure entirely, the faint smile that once lingered at the edges of his face now gone, replaced by a tightening around his eyes that suggested a growing realization he could no longer suppress, because the longer she played, the more impossible it became to maintain the illusion he had created about her. He took another step forward, his attention fixed entirely on the performance, no longer concerned with appearances, no longer aware of the students watching him as closely as they were watching her, because for the first time, he was not in control of the room. The melody rose into a powerful crescendo, rich and layered, each note carrying a weight that resonated through the hall, and settled into the silence with undeniable authority. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone present that Clara Whitfield was not simply capable. She was extraordinary. The realization did not arrive all at once, but in quiet fragments, in exchanged glances, in the stillness of hands that had stopped taking notes, in the absence of movement where there had once been restless energy. And as those fragments came together, they formed a truth that could no longer be ignored. She did not belong at the edge of the room organizing papers. She did not belong in the background, and she certainly did not belong beneath the expectations that had been placed upon her. She had been above them all along. Clara's expression remained unchanged, calm, focused, untouched by the shifting atmosphere around her, as if she had no need to acknowledge it, because the music itself was doing everything that needed to be said. Her hands moved into the final sequence, one of the most technically demanding sections of the piece, the kind that required both speed and precision without sacrificing clarity, and once again, she delivered without hesitation, each note landing exactly where it should, each transition seamless, each movement deliberate. The room felt different now, not just quiet, but transformed, as if something fundamental had shifted in the space between those walls, something that could not be undone. Professor Cole stood completely still, his earlier confidence replaced by a silence that carried far more weight than any words he could have spoken, because there was nothing left for him to correct, nothing left for him to critique, and in that silence, the truth of the moment settled fully into place. Clara Whitfield was not the least experienced person in the room. She was the one they had all failed to recognize. The final sequence approached not with hesitation, but with a quiet inevitability, as if the music itself had already decided how this moment would end long before anyone in the room realized what they were witnessing. And Clara's hands moved with unwavering control through the last measures, each note carrying the weight of everything that had come before it, each transition seamless, precise, and undeniably intentional. There was no rush, no unnecessary flourish, only clarity, the kind that comes from complete mastery. And as the final chord resonated through the hall, it did not feel like an ending as much as a statement, something definitive that settled into the air and refused to fade immediately, lingering just long enough to make sure it had been understood. And then, nothing. The room went silent. Not the polite silence of an audience unsure when to respond, but a deeper, more profound stillness, the kind that follows something unexpected, something that shifts perception so completely that words feel inadequate. And for a brief moment, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe, because the reality of what had just happened was still catching up to them. Clara lowered her hands slowly from the keys, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if she had simply completed a task rather than dismantled every assumption that had been made about her, and she stood from the bench with the same quiet composure she had carried into the moment, offering no acknowledgement of the stunned silence behind her, no attempt to explain, no need to justify. Behind her, Professor Adrian Cole remained exactly where he stood, his gaze fixed on the piano as though it might offer him an answer, his mind working through possibilities that no longer aligned with what he had just seen, because there was no framework within which this made sense, not according to the version of reality he had been operating in, and for the first time in a very long time, he found himself without words. A student shifted in his seat, the faint sound echoing louder than it should have in the stillness, and another glanced around the room, as if seeking confirmation that this had happened, that they had all witnessed the same thing, and slowly, almost reluctantly, the silence began to break, not with applause, not yet, but with the quiet realization spreading from one person to the next that they had just experienced something extraordinary. Cole finally exhaled, a subtle release of tension that he had not noticed building, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer edged with authority, but tempered by something unfamiliar, something closer to uncertainty. That was, he began, but the sentence did not finish, because there was nothing he could say that would re-establish the position he had held just minutes before, nothing that would restore the imbalance that had once defined the room. Clara turned slightly, not fully facing him, but enough to acknowledge his presence, her eyes steady, her demeanor unchanged, and in that brief moment, the contrast between them became undeniable, not in status, not in role, but in understanding, because while he searched for words, she had already said everything that needed to be said. A quiet murmur began to ripple through the students, low voices exchanging observations, realizations, questions that had no immediate answers, and one by one, they began to look at her differently, not as the background figure they had overlooked, but as someone they had failed to see clearly from the beginning. The shift was subtle, but irreversible. Cole straightened slightly, attempting to reclaim some sense of composure, but the effort felt hollow, because authority built on assumption does not survive confrontation with truth, and he knew, even if he would not say it out loud, that something fundamental had changed. Clara stepped away from the piano, her movements as quiet as when she had approached it, and returned to the place she had stood before, as if the moment itself required no follow-up, no explanation, only acceptance. And in that acceptance, the room remained still, not out of uncertainty anymore, but out of respect, because sometimes the most powerful response is not applause, but silence, the kind that acknowledges something greater than expectation, something that cannot be reduced to words. And as the last echoes of the performance faded into memory, one truth remained, clear and undeniable, that the person they had dismissed without a second thought had just redefined the meaning of excellence in front of them all. No one told the room what to do next, and yet something had already changed in the way every person inside it carried themselves. Because silence like that does not end, it transforms. And as Clara returned to her quiet place near the music stands, the distance between her and everyone else no longer felt the same, not physically, but in understanding, in awareness. In the subtle shift that occurs when perception is forced to realign with reality. A student in the second row slowly rose to his feet, not out of instruction, but instinct, as if acknowledging something he did not yet have the words to explain, and then another followed, and another, until the room was no longer seated, until the stillness gave way to recognition, and recognition turned into something deeper, something that demanded expression, and the applause came not all at once, but in a growing wave, hesitant at first, then undeniable, filling the hall with a sound that carried both admiration and a quiet apology that no one spoke out loud. Clara paused briefly, her hand resting lightly against the edge of a music stand, her eyes lifting just enough to take in the moment without fully stepping into it, as if she understood that this was not about celebration, not for her, but about realization for them. Professor Adrian Cole did not join the applause immediately, his hands remaining at his sides as he watched, his mind still attempting to reconcile the image he had constructed with the truth now standing only a few feet away. And when he finally did bring his hands together, the motion felt measured, not forced, but deliberate, as though he was acknowledging not just the performance, but the mistake behind it. The students exchanged looks now, not with amusement, but with a quiet humility, the kind that settles in when confidence has been challenged in a way that cannot be dismissed, and one of them, a young woman seated near the front, stepped forward slightly, her voice careful but sincere as she asked, "Where did you learn to play like that?" The question hanging in the air not as a demand, but as an attempt to understand something that had clearly existed long before this moment. Clara met her gaze calmly, her answer simple, almost understated. "I have been playing for a long time, and nothing more, no explanation of accolades, no mention of stages or recognition, just a truth offered without decoration, because she had never needed validation to define what she already knew." Cole took a step forward then, his presence once again drawing attention, but the authority in it had shifted, softened by the awareness that control does not come from assumption, and his voice, when he spoke, carried a weight it had not held before. "Miss Whitfield," he said, pausing just long enough to choose his words carefully, "I believe I misjudged you." The admission quiet but clear, and though it did not erase what had happened, it marked something important, the moment when perception begins to correct itself. Clara inclined her head slightly, not in submission, but acknowledgement, as if accepting the statement without needing to respond to it, because the correction had already taken place in a way that words could not match. The room settled again, not into the silence of uncertainty, but into a quieter, more grounded awareness, the kind that remains after something has been revealed, and as students slowly returned to their seats, Their movements carried a new kind of intention, a subtle respect that had not been there before. Cole glanced once more at the piano, then back at Clara, and for the first time, he saw not the role she occupied, but the presence she carried, something that had been there all along, waiting to be recognized rather than proven. And in that recognition, the balance of the room shifted permanently, because once you see someone clearly, you cannot return to the version of them you created out of assumption. And as the echoes of the applause faded into the high ceilings of the conservatory, one truth remained quietly anchored in the space they all shared, that excellence does not announce itself, it reveals itself, and when it does, it leaves no room for doubt. The applause faded, but the shift it left behind did not, lingering in the posture of every student, in the quieter tone of their voices, and most noticeably in the space that now existed around Clara Whitfield, no longer the unnoticed corner she had occupied, but a place defined by something unspoken yet deeply understood. She resumed her task with the same calm precision as before, gathering sheet music, aligning pages, restoring order to the room as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, and yet every movement carried a new weight, because now it was being seen, truly seen, by those who had previously overlooked it. A student approached cautiously, his steps slower than before, his usual confidence replaced by a careful respect, and when he spoke, his voice lacked the casual ease it once had, asking if she could look at a passage he had been struggling with, the request simple, but the meaning behind it unmistakable. Clara paused, considering for a brief moment before stepping closer, her attention shifting fully to the score in his hands, her expression thoughtful as she traced the lines with her eyes, and when she responded, her explanation was clear, concise, and precise, offering insight that went beyond technique, touching on interpretation, on phrasing, on the subtle decisions that turn notes into something meaningful. The student listened intently, nodding as he absorbed each word, his earlier assumptions dissolving with every sentence, replaced by something far more valuable than pride, understanding. Nearby, others began to notice, their curiosity drawing them closer, forming a quiet circle not out of obligation, but genuine interest, and one by one, they began to ask their own questions, seeking guidance not from the professor at the front of the room, but from the woman who had just shown them a level of mastery they had not expected to encounter that day. Professor Adrian Cole observed this shift from a short distance, his expression composed, but his thoughts clearly active, because what he was witnessing now extended beyond a single performance. It was a redefinition of roles, a restructuring of authority that he could neither control nor ignore. He stepped forward again, his presence still commanding attention, but now met with a different kind of awareness, one that did not automatically yield, and he spoke with a measured tone, addressing Clara directly, asking where she had studied, the question framed as curiosity, but carrying the weight of someone trying to understand how such a discrepancy could have gone unnoticed. Clara met his gaze without hesitation, her response steady, explaining that she had trained many years ago, that life had taken her in a different direction, that circumstances had changed, but that the music had never left her, and in that simple explanation, there was no trace of regret, only acceptance, as if her path had been exactly what it needed to be. Cole nodded slowly, absorbing the answer, though it did not fully satisfy the deeper question that remained. How had he failed to see this? How had he allowed assumption to define his perception so completely? And for a moment, he seemed to recognize that the answer lay not in her past, but in his own oversight. The students continued to gather around Clara, their earlier hesitation replaced by a growing sense of respect, their questions becoming more thoughtful, more specific, as they began to engage with her not as an outsider, but as someone whose perspective held value, and Clara responded to each one with the same calm clarity, never raising her voice, never asserting authority, yet naturally guiding the conversation in a way that drew others in rather than pushing them away. The dynamic of the room had changed in a way that could not be reversed, not because of a single moment, but because of what that moment revealed. And as the afternoon light shifted across the floor, casting longer shadows through the tall windows, it became clear that the lesson being learned was no longer the one that had been planned, but something far more enduring, something that would remain long after the notes had faded and the room had emptied, because once respect, is earned through truth. It does not disappear. It stays, quietly reshaping everything around it. The conversation around Clara did not fade as quickly as the applause had. Instead, it deepened, taking on a quieter, more focused energy, as if each student present was trying to hold on to something they had only just begun to understand. And as questions continued to surface, they became less about technique and more about perspective, about how she approached music, how she thought through complexity, how she remained so composed under pressure. And Clara answered each one with the same steady clarity, never elevating herself, never diminishing the others, but guiding them in a way that made each answer feel like an invitation rather than a correction. Across the room, Professor Adrian Cole remained observant, his role shifting subtly from instructor to witness. And though he maintained his posture, there was a stillness in him now that had not been there before, a quiet recognition that leadership does not always come from position, but from presence, and that presence had undeniably shifted. A senior student stepped forward, someone who had previously led discussions with confidence, and asked Clara if she would be willing to demonstrate a passage again, not as a test this time, but as a lesson. The request careful, respectful, and Clara paused only briefly before nodding, walking back toward the piano without ceremony, without hesitation, as if the instrument had always been hers to return to. She sat once more at the bench, her movements as measured as before, and placed her hands above the keys. But this time, the room was different, not filled with expectation of failure, but with a quiet anticipation rooted in respect. And when she began to play, the sound carried a different weight, not because the notes had changed, but because the listeners had. She slowed the passage deliberately, allowing each phrase to unfold clearly, explaining softly as she played, pointing out the transitions, the subtle shifts in pressure, the importance of restraint as much as expression, and the students followed closely, their attention sharpened by the understanding that they were witnessing something rare, not just skill, but the ability to share it without ego. Cole moved closer, not interrupting, but listening, his earlier authority replaced by a willingness to observe, to learn, and for a moment, he seemed less concerned with maintaining control and more focused on absorbing what he had previously overlooked. Clara paused mid-phrase, glancing at the student who had made the request and invited him to try, her tone encouraging rather than instructive, and as he took her place at the bench, there was no pressure in her presence, only support, the kind that builds confidence rather than tests it. He played, more carefully now, applying what she had shown him, and though he did not reach her level, there was improvement, clear and immediate, and when he finished, Clara nodded slightly, offering a small adjustment, a refinement that elevated the entire passage, and the student's expression shifted from concentration to realization, the kind that marks genuine learning. Around them, the others watched with a new kind of engagement, no longer measuring themselves against each other, but against a deeper standard they had only just encountered, and in that space, the dynamic of the room continued to evolve, becoming less about hierarchy and more about understanding. Cole finally spoke again, his voice calm, no longer carrying the sharp edge it once had, acknowledging the clarity of her instruction, the effectiveness of her approach, and though he did not say more, the respect in his tone was unmistakable, not given lightly, but earned fully. Clara accepted it with the same quiet composure she had carried from the beginning, neither seeking it nor rejecting it, simply allowing it to exist without altering who she was. The light outside had shifted further now, the golden tones softening into the early hints of evening, and as the session continued, it was clear that what had begun as a lesson in technique had become something far more meaningful, a redefinition of how knowledge is shared, how respect is formed, and how easily both can be overlooked when judgment comes too quickly. And in the steady rhythm of notes and voices that followed, one truth remained quietly present in every exchange, that real mastery does not demand attention, it transforms it, leaving behind a room that no longer sees the same way it once did. The session did not end the way it was supposed to, and everyone in the room knew it, not because the schedule had changed, but because something far more important had taken its place, something that could not be written on a syllabus or measured by a performance grade. And as the final minutes of the afternoon stretched into evening, the light outside dimming into soft amber tones, The atmosphere inside the hall settled into a quiet understanding that lingered long after the last note had been played. Clara Whitfield gathered the remaining sheets of music with the same steady care she had shown at the beginning of the day, her movements unhurried, unaffected by the attention that now followed her, and one by one, the students approached her, not with the casual ease they once had, but with a sincerity that carried both curiosity and respect, thanking her, asking small questions, offering quiet acknowledgments that needed no elaboration. She responded to each of them with the same calm presence, never positioning herself above them, never drawing attention to what had happened, as if the moment itself had already said everything that mattered. Professor Adrian Cole remained near the piano, his hand resting lightly against its polished surface, his gaze thoughtful as he watched the room gradually return to motion, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed the silence to sit without filling it, because he understood now that not every lesson required his voice to define it. When Clara passed by him on her way toward the exit, he straightened slightly, meeting her with a nod that carried more meaning than any formal statement, a recognition not just of her skill, but of the oversight that had allowed it to go unnoticed. And though he did not speak again, the shift in his posture made it clear that something within him had changed, something that would not easily revert back to what it had been before. The students began to gather their belongings, their conversations quieter, more reflective, as if each of them was processing the experience in their own way. And as they stepped out into the cooling evening air, the echoes of the day remained with them, not as a memory to be admired, but as a standard to be reconsidered. Clara paused briefly at the doorway, her hand resting against the frame as she looked back once, not at the piano, not at the professor, but at the room itself, and there was no triumph in her expression, no sense of victory, only a quiet acknowledgement that something meaningful had occurred, something that did not need to be claimed in order to exist. She stepped outside, the door closing softly behind her, and the world beyond the conservatory carried on as it always had, cars passing along the street, distant sounds of conversation, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing without interruption. And yet for those who had been inside that room, the day would not be so easily folded into routine. Because what they had witnessed was not just a performance, not just a moment of unexpected talent, but a reminder, clear and undeniable, that ability does not always announce itself, that presence does not always demand attention, and that the quietest person in the room may be the one who understands it most completely. And in the stillness that followed, long after Clara Whitfield had disappeared into the evening, the lesson remained, not spoken, not written, but deeply understood by all who had been there, that respect is not given based on appearance. It is revealed through truth, and once revealed, it cannot be taken back, only remembered.